Chike Aguh, the head of Economic Mobility Pathways at the Education Design Lab. Thanks again for joining us, Chike. We're recording now for the courses. So my first question, you work in the middle of some really exciting developments and really in some ways revolutions in education and technology and the workforce and the nexus of all three of these things. And so I'd like to start off our conversation just hearing from you, what are the most significant changes happening today in this realm of where technology and education and the workforce meet?
So first of all, again, thank you for having me. Thanks to the University of Maryland, the Duke Institute, and just the entire course for having me here today. So for me, where I spend a lot of my time, and I think what's kind of most revolutionary right now is I spend a lot of my time thinking about what's broadly called the future of work. And that's a lot of definitions for a lot of people, but I really define it by 4 questions. First, what is the work of the future going to be? Meaning, is there actually going to be work for all the people that we have here in our country and will have here in our country? That's a debate. Some people say yes, some people say no. The answer is quite honestly, it's sculpting smoke. We don't really know. But there are things that we can do practically to make sure that there is work and meaningful work for people, particularly in growing fields. That's number 1. Number 2, how do we make sure that people are prepared to do that work with the skills and capacities to be successful? That's the technical skills, obviously, the nuts and bolts of doing certain jobs, but that's also the non-technical capacities, leadership, communication, things like that we know are just as critical to being successful. Thirdly is, how do we make sure the work and the workers find each other? Right now, because of reasons of bias and inefficiency, you have people who can do the work and work that needs to be done, and they don't find each other. For example, and my figures may be off here a little bit. I believe, I want to say 60% of administrative assistants today do not have a college degree. But if you look at job postings for an administrative assistant, 100% of them require a college degree. So unless you believe that every administrative assistant is bad or poor at their job, we have a mismatch between what's being asked for and what's actually required to do the job. If you can do the job, you should get the job. And then lastly, what is the system of supports for workers throughout that entire process, particularly if you fall out of the labor market? The way I like to talk about this is, how do we go from a social safety net? And I actually don't like that metaphor because if you think about it, it just catches you. But what you really want is an economic trampoline, where you fall out, you're caught, and you're bounced back into the labor market at least as good a place as when you left. And so those are the 4 big questions that I really think about, and they affect everything. They affect employers, they affect how education works. And for me, what I think about now in this time is we have this confluence of 3 crises at once. You have the novel crisis of COVID. You have an unemployment, depression level unemployment. Again, in the state of Maryland, we have hundreds of thousands of people out of work who were in work in January. And then lastly, you have, frankly, this crisis we've had for 400 years, which is structural racial inequity. And all of them have come together. And if anything, they have accelerated all the trends in terms of automation technology in the economy that we're talking about. Again, think about how many of us didn't know what Zoom was 6 months ago and had to make it a part of our lives. Think about how much more you use e-commerce than you did before, how you had to learn what contact tracing was. It has literally changed, but also accelerated a lot of the trends that we had seen before. And so the question is now, how do we take this, I call it the COVID lemon, and squeeze some lemonade from it, to be very frank, so that we can truly rethink what we were doing before. And I'll use a really key example, a cool example that I literally just came across. So as you think about this unemployment crisis, what's interesting is if you look at the data, there are still jobs that are growing. There are still jobs in industries that have shortages. And I'll use one really clear example. Weirdly, claims adjusters in the insurance industry, meaning the people that when you file a claim, they come and make sure that the claim is what you say it is, so that there's not insurance fraud. A great company called Tailspin, they basically are doing virtual training of claims adjusters using augmented reality and virtual reality. They basically now mail you a headset, you put the headset on, and all of a sudden you are in a house where there has been a fire, and you're going around and evaluating the claim. And they can not only have you do that, but also assess you during that, and they can say, hey, this person, Charlie, passed the test, and therefore virtually can now be a claims adjuster. These are the types of things we've never done before in workforce development, in worker training, and that's just one example of the myriad of changes in practice that we can see. And so for me, I'm lucky. I get to work at the intersection of higher education, industry, and policy. And these are the types of things that we need to proliferate across all three. And I think we'll come to this a little later. But what's been clear to me about this challenge, this problem, is that no one sector, no one company, no one organization is going to solve this by themselves. And what's critical here, the last trend I'll say, is the trend toward more collaboration, more cooperation amongst sectors, amongst organizations, is only accelerating. In fact, I would argue it may have been a really critical need, nice to have before, but now it's critical.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned a lot of changes that are happening. They were happening before, and now they're being accelerated because of COVID, and also maybe aggravate, like I think some underlying issues in our country have been aggravated because of COVID and have been brought to the surface in the middle of this. But again, issues that are intersectional, race and social justice, employment, education, those are issues before, and now they're even bigger issues. The audience for this, our group here that's with us, are aspiring nonprofit leaders and social entrepreneurs, and some current nonprofit leaders and social entrepreneurs as well. And so I'm curious, this is a broad question, but what role should nonprofits and social entrepreneurs play in helping, develop or redevelop the workforce and address some of these challenges that you've mentioned, or proliferate some of the solutions that you mentioned? Like, what is the role of the nonprofits and social entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And again, everyone has a role to play here. And I would say a couple. I think number one, particularly for those of you who are leading community-based organizations or thinking about leading community-based organizations, a couple of things. One, you all are likely closer to the front line than, frankly, most of the people in power, whether they be in industry, whether they be in government. And what I mean by that is you are likely the closest to the people with the problem. Therefore, you have an opportunity and an obligation to relate that voice to folks who have power. And more importantly, you have the obligation, the opportunity to open the door for those folks to come to the table and frankly speak for themselves, which so rarely happens. And that's not just important because it's morally right, it's also important because you will come up with better solutions. Policymakers, industry will come up with the best solutions if they hear from the people who have the problems. And you all can be that bridge, and frankly can be the doorstop to the room of the door of power, so those folks can do that. That's number one. I'd say number two, generally, and I'm going to say this generally because I'm going to have a caveat here, and it's more piece of advice. Community-based organizations, nonprofits, social entrepreneurs can be more nimble. You can try things at a smaller scale before government or industry will. For industry, they have shareholders, they have owners. For government, they have voters. You all, frankly, your constituency are the folks that you serve, and that gives you an opportunity to try things that haven't been tried before. Whether that be with technology, whether that be through practice, whether that be through insights. And so my third piece, and it's not a question you asked me, Charlie, but it's really important, is do not be risk averse. Don't be stupid, don't be reckless, but do not be risk averse, because quite honestly, the people most suited to take those risks are actually social entrepreneurs. Now, I'll broaden this a little bit. I was talking to a great friend of mine, Wes Moore, who runs the Robin Hood Foundation, good Maryland boy, who we're very proud of. But one thing he talks about is for the funders who are out there, how do you treat philanthropic capital like risk capital? How do you use it as a way to catalyze new types of practices that are going to make outsized difference? And that's really where social enterprise, social entrepreneurs can play. Bring the voice of those who are living the problems to the fore. And then secondly, address the problems that they're talking about with real solutions that haven't been tried before in big, bold ways.
Mm-hmm. I know that you've done this yourself. You've practiced this yourself as a social entrepreneur. You were previously the CEO of a social enterprise called Everyone On. So I'm curious, what was the issue that you were trying to address? Who were the people that you were trying to solve? What change ultimately were you trying to make as the leader of Everyone On?
Yeah, I mean, it's really funny. I was privileged to lead that organization for 3 years, and it's funny now seeing the time that we're in. The issue that we were focused on was how do you connect every American to the internet and the opportunity it brings, and how do you close this pernicious digital divide once and for all? And that issue always burned very bright for me. But seeing it now, again, for those of you who have kids who have just started school, I remember having the debate about whether the internet was a necessity, whether it was a human right. And I think now that debate is settled. If you are denied access to the internet, you are being denied access to an education. Literally today, you're being denied access to a job. I ask people, when was the last time you filled out a paper job application? And more, you are being denied access to healthcare. Because my wife is a physician, she works at Johns Hopkins. She spends the majority of her time seeing patients virtually now. If they didn't have an internet connection, they would not be able to see her. And so the internet is the conduit to so many parts of our society and so many opportunities that you are literally trapping people in poverty if you don't have that be an issue. That's an issue that I started working on back in 2015. So our goal was very simply, and just to give a sense, at that time, 1 in 5 Americans was not on the internet. And I always say that's crazy in the country that invented the internet. And what was key was when we looked at the source of the problem, and this is a debate at times that was had, was, well, maybe those people just don't want the internet. They don't see the value. There's a tiny little bit of that. But really, when you ask people, and Pew Charitable Trust does this every single year, they do a survey on this question. The number one reason why people are not on the internet is because it costs too much. They cannot afford it. Particularly when you talk about people near or below the poverty line. And just to give you a sense, the poverty line is $24,000 a year for a family of 4. I think maybe $23,500. I'm probably by a couple $100. If you live in public housing, that's $14,700 a year for a family of 4. That means that you make roughly $1,000 a month, a little more than that. And so you're going to ask that family to spend $100, $150 a month on the internet when they need to figure out how they're going to pay their rent, how they're going to eat, how kids are going to get to school, so on and so forth. That's not tenable. And so what we worked on was basically a couple of things. One, how do we basically create price points that people who are poor can actually afford? And not even just poor, but frankly who aren't rich can actually afford, number one. And we did that working directly with industry, usually coming to price points around $10 a month. Secondly, we had basically a proprietary platform that we created, everyoneon.org. It still runs today. You can go see it, put in your zip code, and you'll see the options that are available to you. And then thirdly, working directly with community-based organizations on the ground, churches, schools, libraries, community-based organizations, to go directly to families so that they can sign up and get those available. And when I left the organization, we had connected over 500,000 people in 48 states to the internet in their homes, most of whom were below the poverty line, most of whom did not have it at the time. Still nowhere near enough, but one of my big goals was, one, to show that we could do it. And then secondly, which was a mission, was bringing that voice, the voice of us doing the work, but also the voice of folks who are unconnected, to policymakers at the FCC, in Congress, to say, here are rules and policies that must change. And it's gratifying to me to actually see on both sides of the aisle now this issue of internet availability being talked about as a necessity, whether it be for industry, so business can actually grow, or whether it be for families who just want to make sure that their kids can log into their Zoom classes so that they can kind of get their education. So that's the change that we were looking to see. And our goal was, we knew we wouldn't connect every single person, but the way I used to like to say it is, we want to work on removing all the barriers. So the only thing that stands between closing the digital divide and where we are now is time. And our goal was to remove all the other barriers in the price point, in terms of lack of awareness, in terms of policy, and still a journey and work in progress. But that was our goal. And we used to call it kind of the hockey stick. Ideally, we bend the curve so that after that, it's just a matter of time before everyone is connected. Particularly, and I just want to last to say here, particularly people of color. If you were to go to the city of Baltimore, for example, between 25 and 33% of families in the city of Baltimore do not have access to an internet connection. If you were to go to the city of Detroit, similar. And again, this is the thing about the digital divide. It is not a rural issue, or only a rural issue. The majority of people who are unconnected live in places like Baltimore, live in places like DC, live in places like Columbia, Maryland. They live in places like Salisbury, and live in Philly, New York, so on and so forth. And so understanding that this is a problem where cost is the main barrier. Now we have to work across sectors, particularly with industry, to get costs that folks can afford, are really important. And the last thing I'll say is, what we found really interestingly was that this also was a business opportunity. One thing that we found when we got folks connected was, frankly, the folks that we worked with, who people were afraid of, frankly, wouldn't be reliable customers, is one, their churn rate, meaning the amount of time they stayed being an internet customer for a said company, was actually longer than average than a market rate customer. And then secondly, they actually were more likely to pay their bills on time, which again shows that when you can prove it, when you actually can do something, you can begin to break down some of these narratives and silos. And one piece of advice I'll definitely give is there'll be a temptation for a social entrepreneur to try and create the perfect instrument, the perfect program, and you won't start until it's perfect. Go and do something, even if it's small, because one, that's the only way to learn. I guarantee you the first time you do something, it's going to be wrong. And so the question is, how wrong, with how much resources invested are you going to be wrong? With a little bit or a lot? So I'm sure you all talked about lean startup and that whole methodology, things like that. That is the way to do this. And then you need a bias to action, or otherwise you'll never do anything.
Yeah, I love that message. And you're right. We do teach the lean startup methodology in our social entrepreneurship courses. And the undergraduate course, the intro to social entrepreneurship, is actually called Do Good Now.
Excellent.
And it's really focused on pushing student, like, get out there, you have an idea, test it, talk to people, like, try to make something happen. And then you'll start learning. That's how change happens. And so,
Absolutely.
well, thanks for talking about your work at Everyone On. I'm grateful that you guys were doing this years before COVID crisis, because how many, like you said, 500,000 people you helped, and that, vital to their lives now. I want to dig in a little bit deeper to your work at Everyone On, because the theme of the course that we're recording this for this week is leading people and making change. And so, as the leader of that organization, what was your strategy, or what were some of your favorite tactics for leading people towards making the changes that you were talking about?
And so you'll hear me say some things from good things I did, and also from mistakes that I made. Also, as a leader, you will make mistakes, and the question is, how do you kind of forgive yourself, but also recommit yourself the next day to kind of doing better and not failing in the same way. So you'll hear me say some things that I probably then, and even probably now, not totally mastered. So that's always, it's the place of humility that I think all of us need to speak from. On my best days, there were a couple of things I did well on my best days. One, I was really clear about where we were going. Those folks who work for me would always hear me talk about what I call the million. Our goal was to connect 1 million people by the end of 2020 to the internet who didn't have it before. And so right now the organization stands at a little over 800,000, which is, which I'm so proud of, again, even though I've stepped away for actually now more than 2 years. So that was one. I was really clear about where we were going, and also clear about kind of the levers that we were going to pull. Look, we were always going to work with industry to create more options that were affordable. So we were scouring. We find big internet providers, small internet providers in different parts of the country that we weren't serving, as many options as possible. So we knew the more options that there were, more people that we could serve. So as long as you were doing something that did that, that was always good. Two, we were always, our platform, which again was mobilely available, internet available, that had to be super accurate, super tight. So we were always, focusing on making that better. We were lucky. We had a number of technology partners who made that possible. And then thirdly, as many community partnerships as we could have in as many places, because we knew we couldn't be everywhere. We were a lean organization. And again, we had tens of millions of people who weren't connected. Therefore, we had to have partners. When I left, we had over 700 partner organizations around the country. That included the American Library Association. That included over 30 mayor's offices, including 5 governor's offices. A number of nonprofits you've never heard of, but in their community have access to people who we need. So those are the things that I would always continually focus on. And the second thing I'll say is, as a leader, you cannot repeat those messages enough. So if someone once told me, think about your parents, whoever raised you, think about a mentor or a coach, and think about the things they told you so often that you rolled your eyes. That is how repetitive you must be as a leader. We would have a retreat. We would talk about something, and I would say something, and I thought kind of it sunk in because I had thought about it so much. And then people would say, but hey, like, is that million things still happening? I'm like, of course it's still happening. We talked about it, but that wasn't their fault. That was mine. You have to pound that message every single day, and it's successful when people start to repeat it back to you. And even more so when people make choices differently based on those messages. Hey, I'm going to spend my time on working with my local library because I know that's one of our levers. That's one of those moments when you just sit back and you're like, okay, cool, they got it. The third thing that I'll say here is leaving that room for challenge. One thing that I think people know about me is I don't mind challenge. I like it. And for me, I used to work at a management consulting firm. And one of the things they talked about was the duty to dissent, not the allowance, not the responsibility, but the duty to dissent. They went so far as to say that if you believe the contrary opinion to what was being proposed or being pursued, and you were right and it was found out, you should be fired. That's how seriously they took it. And that was the responsibility of everyone, from the most junior person all the way up to the biggest partner. And I very much took that. In fact, when outsiders would watch our meetings, they at times were uncomfortable with the way that people challenged me. And I said, well, what am I paying them for? If I wanted to just have them agree with me, I can just work for myself. The goal is to have people who are going to push you and challenge you, and also challenge your frameworks and challenge the strategy sometimes. And that doesn't mean as a leader you always take it, but you have to have it, because the opposite of that, which is frankly a bunch of yes men or yes women, is you don't want that. Because quite honestly, you think about the worst organizations, think about the biggest debacles that you've seen, whether it be corporate America, government, nonprofit space, they come from that culture. You want a culture of challenge where you can be respectful, but also super thoughtful, super rigorous, and super interrogative. And so on my best days, that was what I did well. And also, we were a virtual organization. So half of our team was here in the DC area. Half our team was spread across the country. I had 3 people in California, 1 person in North Carolina, 1 person in Miami, 1 person in New Jersey, as well as, again, 700 partner organizations in almost every state in the country. So this whole video conference is actually quite familiar to me. Similarly, even to my time working for General McChrystal in my prior role. So I got to learn that really quickly, and I would say, look, that's going to be the future. And one of the benefits of it is that you can potentially take advantage of talent everywhere, which again is just going to be the reality going forward. And so for you as leaders, think really thoughtfully. To do X job, where does this person have to be? Your instinct will be, hey, I want them here near me. I want to see them, so on. So that's human nature. But you can potentially get access to the talent that you wouldn't otherwise if you kind of think more broadly. And again, I was forced to, because the organization that I initially came into was like that anyway.
Makes sense. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit. Just got a couple more questions for you, but want to get as much advice from you as I can for our students and for our other guests before I turn it over to them to ask you their questions. So you've accomplished a lot, and you're involved in influential, cutting edge work that has the power to make a real impact. So I'm curious, what has driven you in your career, and what advice can you share with people, particularly students who want to do well professionally, and don't want to sacrifice their career in order to make an impact? They want to, as the cliche goes, they want to do well while doing good. Sure. What advice do you have for somebody like that?
Oh, wow. Follow me. I'm going to come to answer your question, but it'll take me a couple places. So I actually want to stay with me. So for me personally, I like Bill Clinton. He has this phrase, "We're all prisoners of biography," and I'm very much that. My family, and some of you have probably heard me say this. My family is from Nigeria, in a small rural village that most Nigerians themselves will never go to and never visit. My grandparents didn't go past middle school. My parents grew up over the hill from one another. You literally can see my mother's house from my father's house there. And they had Peace Corps volunteers in their classrooms, and both of them, frankly, got lucky. My dad got a scholarship, which he could never have afforded otherwise, to come to an American public university, the University of Texas, down in Austin. My mom got to go to Rutgers University in New Jersey. And I say very simply, I would not be here without American education, American opportunity, very simply. And so I've always felt, I'm sitting here talking to all of you because the coin of fate landed in my favor. And the best thing that I can do to honor that is to try and replicate for others the opportunities that have been replicated for me. And so that's just how I think about the world and how I've always try to think about my work. So I say that's kind of one, just that's kind of where my thoughts come from. That's one. I think two, I've tried to, and have been I was pushed very early in my career to think, where can you make the biggest difference? Someone said, where can you be the best in the world? And that's a really introspective question. And so someone, pushed me very early on in my career to say, hey, look, because of the road that you walked, also, I started my career working for Mayor Bloomberg in New York City in education policy. I was a teacher in New York City. and basically saying, hey, look, you have this background and skills, and you also been very close to the front line. If you stay on this path and gain some additional skills, you could frankly become um, potentially the best in the world at this. I won't claim that right now, but basically saying this is your leverage point by which you can move the world. And that also means you're making a choice to not do other things. I care deeply about climate change. And actually, I found some really interesting intersections between climate change and workforce development. But there are people who are experts, and I follow them, and I ask what I have people that I call on that. Healthcare, deeply important. But again, I have a brain trust of people that I talked about healthcare. Again, very interesting intersections between that and workforce development. But it means that you have to make choices, and that's hard. And the question is, I'd say again, for folks who are on the call is, what am I going to be the best in the world at? And where do I draw on a brain trust of people to advise me on other things? I go to Zion Church in Landover, Maryland, right near FedEx Field. And my pastor, he talks about this for people who are starting businesses. And I think it's true also of entrepreneurs in the social space. He says, when you don't know how, the answer is who. And so for me, when I think about leadership, there are just things that I'm not going to know how to do. And the answer is I need to bring the right people onto the team so that they can fill in that gap for me. I think the last thing that I'll say here is, if you look at my career, I've kind of, and I would love to say it was all intentional, but it's kind of, I think, been circumstance. I've traveled between sectors. I've done government, nonprofit, and the private sector more than once. And one of the critical kind of skill shortages right now are people who can translate between all those spaces. And I would say for each of you who are in social enterprise, when this term really kind of became a term of art, probably now 12 years ago, I remember going up to Harvard and the social enterprise initiative, which started at HBS, again, about probably 10 years ago. Both sides of that phrase are really important, social and enterprise. And so think about how you can move between sectors and keep your eye on the ball, which is a problem. For me, it's the future of work, and how is there a future of work that includes every single American, no matter what they look like, where they're from. Your problem may be climate change. Your problem may be, I know Shantia White is on here, social work, young kids, and making sure that they're in the best place. But how do you work on that problem from a number of different vantage points? Because what it allows you to do is it allows every job search to not be a life or death struggle. You're not always looking for that perfect job, because from wherever you are, you'll figure out how to work on the problem. And then from there, depending on your season of life, you'll be able to, hey, you know what, I got to make some money right now. I'm going to go here, focused on the same problem, but I'm going to be able to, I need to take care of my family right now. Hey, I have a little more flexibility here. I'm going to go into government, or I'm going to lead this, or I'm going to lead this space. But, I'll end off with this, Charles, and would really love to get to questions. But if you watch President Obama talk to his last class of White House interns, someone asked roughly this question. And he said, look, particularly in Washington, D.C., a lot of people are walking around saying, I want to be this, I want to be that. And the challenge is not everyone can be X title or that title. And not everyone can be congressman or senator or secretary or whatever it is. But if you focus on a problem to be solved, you can figure out how to work on that problem no matter where you are. And so if I had to say the thing that you all should have the most clarity about is, what is the problem that I want to solve, that I believe I am best placed to help solve? If you have that, then that allows you, I think, to have the flexibility and the creativity to figure out where you need to be to take care of your life circumstances, when you need to. So again, Charles, thanks for staying with me there, but it's a really important question.
Oh, that's an awesome message. I love the way you frame that. My last question for you is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? When we do this again in 5 years, where are you going to be?
Great question. I think, per kind of the last thing I said, that the title is less important to me. I think the most important thing is that I would love to have said, for the Community College Growth Engine Fund that I lead currently, that we helped 4,000 people get into work, and that we put ourselves on the path to helping millions. The most important thing is that I'm pushing the rock up the hill on this problem. And if anything, hopefully gaining more skills, getting more tools to create more impact along the way. That's my measure of success. Where I am that question, it's weird, if you had asked me that question 5 years ago, it would have been a lot more important to me. I think now knowing now the problem that I want to solve, I trust the future to figure itself out a little more than I did probably when I was earlier in my career.
Cool. That's really inspiring. Thank you. Thanks for giving me so much of your time. And thank you also to our other participants for letting me ask Chike all my questions.